A forthcoming audit of a local 2020 race in New Hampshire is now catching the eye of former President Trump. A November recount revealed 4 Republican legislature candidates received 300 more votes than the original tally out of 800,000 cast. Those numbers had nothing to do with the presidential race, yet Mr. Trump is falsely claiming they somehow do, tying the issue to his baseless claims of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. In a statement Wednesday, he congratulated what he called the Patriots of Windham for, quote, working tirelessly to reveal the real facts of the election. Mr. Trump won more votes than President Biden did in the town. In response, the state's Republican governor said a discrepancy of 300 votes out of over 800,000 cast does not constitute massive election fraud. 16 other recounts conducted in New Hampshire after the 2020 election found no errors. For more, let's bring in Dante Scala. He is a political science professor at the University of New Hampshire. Dante, thank you very much for being with us. So 16 recounts seems like a lot. Is that normal for New Hampshire? And what is the premise for this latest upcoming audit?
Yeah, 16 sounds like a lot, but remember that we have hundreds of elections here in New Hampshire, primarily because we have such a large state legislature. So the discrepancy that was found in this particular race in Windham was larger than normal because, as you mentioned, the Republicans got a few hundred votes more after the recount, and the Democrat got a little bit less, about 100 votes. So they decided ultimately a state law was passed, a special law, to have an audit to essentially check the recount and check the voting machines that did the count to see why the discrepancy. But this audit is separate from a recount. Yeah. It's not going to change the results of the election.
So how are elections officials explaining the discrepancy, and what is the very latest on the audit?
Yeah, they're still at a bit of a loss to explain why the discrepancy was so large, in terms of the hundreds of votes. Now, there's 800,000 votes cast statewide in New Hampshire, but this was a bit large for a discrepancy, and they still haven't quite figured out why that is, whether something was amiss with the voting machines, or perhaps something was amiss during the recount procedure that took place. So they've got now a committee of 3 to do the audit, and that committee is going to proceed over the next several weeks to figure out exactly what happened and run through the whole process of, counting the votes again, checking the voting machines, and so forth.
Well, former President Trump won the small New Hampshire town by 629 votes while losing the state by nearly 60,000 votes. Why does it matter to him about a discrepancy in a seemingly inconsequential town? Why is this continuing to persist as an issue?
Well, for the same reason that the former president is still crying voter fraud 6 months after an election was held in which there was found no evidence of voter fraud that would change results anywhere in the country. So I think the president is grasping at straws at this point, and he's trying to say in his statement that what happened in one town in New Hampshire somehow could have affected the entire statewide elections for president, which is, of course, ridiculous. But at this point, the former president is grasping at whatever he can to try to keep this issue alive, despite all evidence to the contrary.
Well, let's switch gears here. Let's talk about Chris Sununu. The term-limited Republican governor says he's considering a run against incumbent Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan next year. How big of a challenge would that pose for Hassan?
Because, Chris Sununu could run for governor again if he wished to, but there's a lot of question about whether that's in his future plans. He is the most popular politician in the state of New Hampshire, Republican or Democratic. He won re-election easily in 2020, winning just about 2/3 of the vote, more than 60%. And he's enjoyed very high approval numbers, especially during this past year, the pandemic. He's gotten generally
72%, according to a poll that we saw, right? Is that 72% is astounding.
Yeah, he's got generally good reviews for his handling of the emergency pandemic here in New Hampshire. And so at this point, we've seen this before where governors have moved to run for the U.S. Senate. That's what Jeanne Shaheen did. That's what Maggie Hassan did. And now they both serve in the U.S. Senate after being governors. And as is typical, governors here tend to be more popular than people we send to Washington. And that's true right now. Chris Sununu's favorability is higher than what we see for the incumbent Democrat, Maggie Hassan.
Well, undeclared voters outnumber registered partisans in New Hampshire. How is Senator Hassan trying to appeal to independents?
Yeah, that's the key thing. I mean, we see partisans on both sides pretty dug in for the Republican or the Democrat. Independents, there's a little more in flux. Now, a lot of them are really partisans in disguise. They register as independents, but they're really typically behave as Democrats or Republicans, but there are some real independents among them. And what we'll see the senator try and do is to show how she differs perhaps from other Democrats on some issues. We saw that with regard to raising the minimum wage. And I expect that she'll spend a lot of time over the next year talking about how she is a senator for the people of New Hampshire, not so much for her party. And that's typical procedure for an incumbent running for re-election, because we know that in midterms, it's the president's party in power that typically suffers. And so for Maggie Hassan, she's going to keep a close eye on how well Joe Biden is doing here in the state, because his approval numbers may well have a lot to do with determining her fate in running for re-election.
All right, we will be watching. Dante Scala, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.